All right, there we go. Looks like we got it here. So, how we're doing for a Thursday? It appears as though Montana is going to slowly start opening up. And to give you what I know of, and I'm sure some of you might have read the email from the superintendent, school is most certainly going to continue until May, or continue to be closed till May 8th. And after that, I think the steps are going to be real tentative. Maybe 1 or 2 days a week they might bring us in, maybe not. I think there's a lot of issues that they're going to have to think about later or come up with some solution. There's going to be huge cleaning issues. Number of teachers and substitute teachers aren't going to be able to come in at all. I don't know how much things are going to change. I would love for things to get back to normal and open up, but I can't imagine it happening totally. So we'll see where this is going. I think we should be nervous about it, but at the same time hopeful. So we'll see after that. And a couple more things. Remember, tomorrow the rest of chapter 26 is due. My expectation is, a little 8-question quiz. It's going to be a really basic quiz that I'll whip up real fast. No, I have not made it yet. And I am going to put some reading in for the Treaty of Versailles. Next week, we are going to have a DBQ. And did I say Treaty of Versailles? Wow. The atomic bomb. And so that will be on, I'll make it do the whole week. And don't forget, you have a section from the review book. Pick 2 of the documents. Explain in your own words. I don't want any quotes. Explain how you would use it to answer the question. I'm not a big fan of the question. And also, for one of those documents, use HAP. Basically, explain why they have that bias. So you're not summarizing the document. You're showing how the elements of the document can be used to reinforce your argument, and then for one of them, why they have that bias. So blank believes this because of historical content, their point of view, or purpose. So basically what I'm looking for are 3 sentences, 3 good sentences. And don't forget, you have to cite that. So cite Doc 1 or whatever at the end of the sentence or sentences. So if you use 2 sentences at the end of the second sentence, 1 sentence after the end of the first sentence. So stuff we've talked about before, but just a quick review. And maybe one of these days I'll have to talk a little bit about economics. I'm going to do that in special topics. At 1:20, I'm going to get on and talk a little bit about what's going on here. But you can definitely tell that this country is still very conservative when all the bailout plans and everything is designed to funnel money to the top. Remember, conservative economics, the idea is those on top should have the wealth because they know how to create wealth, and that will lead to general prosperity. And everything that they've done is designed to funnel money to the top. And you could argue that's good policy or that policy, but remember the other thing I told you about a boom-bust cycle. When there is a bust, the very wealthy who survive will get significantly wealthier. And that's what we're seeing now. What did I see? Bill Gates in the last month and a half has gained something like $4.3 billion. That's what's happening right now. And for the vast majority of people will come out of this with less wealth. And that includes me and probably most other people. But especially people who have been laid off because companies aren't going. So let's get back to this. Okay, so we talked about mobilization and went through women in the workforce, what happened to Mexican Americans in the Zoot Suit riots, the double V, the Great Migration, and this wave of riots, including Detroit in 1943, mostly whites attacking black or Mexican Americans, and the War Production Board, Office of Price Administration. So we went through a lot of different things. So let's go ahead and today and tomorrow we're going to finish up the war. And we talked about 1942. That was Hitler's last big effort to get the oil in the South. But Stalingrad would become key. Right there, Stalingrad. And just one sec. All right, now we got the pointer. So Stalingrad right here. And The Germans retreated, or Stalingrad right here. Here's where the oil was, down here. And both Hitler and Stalin decided that Stalingrad would be a city of great prestige. Now, the thing about Stalingrad that's important to understand here is that the Germans didn't have to take it. Yes, it was an important city, but they could have bypassed it. They could have went to the Volga a different way. It's a city that stretches for miles along the Volga River, which is over a mile-wide river. And so this is a huge wall right there. And the German army really lacked troops. And to get bogged down in building by building fighting would be a terrible burden on the German army and use up their reserves very quickly. But that's what happened here. All through the fall and winter of 42-43, the Germans attacked Stalingrad, and the Soviets held that building by building, basement by basement. I guess some of the most brutal fighting were in stairway by stairway. And this turned into a horrific battle of attrition. And the Soviets lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers and well over 1 million people to hold Stalingrad. Most of the civilians were stuck in the city, hiding in basements or even in the sewers. But when building by building they would have to take, or that the Germans would have to take, they were bled nearly white. A couple different times, as this map shows, this long city along the river. They got close to the river a few places, but a few, like for example, big factories right here, the Soviets held. In fact, the Soviets were still making T-34 tanks, and they would drive right out of the factory into the battle with the roof blown off. That should give you the idea of the sacrifice of the Soviet people. To this day, at Stalingrad, they still find not only unexploded munitions, but there are still hundreds of thousands of unburied bodies, and they find bones all the time of people who died and then covered by the rubble in this fight. This is where snipers would come into play, using the buildings as cover, especially, well, both sides use snipers effectively, and trust me, nobody on either side likes snipers. But when winter hit, the Germans still had not taken Stalingrad, and their offensive had generally failed. And much like what happened the year before, the Soviets counterattacked, Operation Uranus. They counterattacked. And this map, I gotta do this relatively fast, but here's Stalingrad, where's my, right here. Stalingrad is here. Can everyone hear me? It appears as though no one has reported that you can't hear me. So I'm assuming I'm good, which is good. But so here's Stalingrad. To feed men into Stalingrad, they took most of the German soldiers in there. So allies like Italians and Romanians here and Hungarians here were trying to hold their flanks. And the Soviets counterattacked and swept through around the Germans, and the Germans isolated out of supplies. Winter hits, or think about it, it's 20, 30, 40 degrees below zero. Here are Soviet troops on the outskirts of Stalingrad, and they cut off the German forces in Stalingrad. Here are Soviet forces from the two wings meeting. There's a Soviet T-34 tank, Soviets on the advance, and they surrounded and cut off Stalingrad. And the troops inside Stalingrad were now cut off from supplies and starving. Hitler, remember, he took overall command, would not allow the German troops inside Stalingrad to break out. Germans were not strong enough anymore to cut through the Soviet lines, and eventually the Soviets, or the Germans, had to surrender. And this would be the second turning point of the war. The Germans can be beaten. Remember, Moscow was the turning point that the Germans could be stopped. Stalingrad, they could be beaten. And over 300,000 German soldiers would die or be taken prisoner at Stalingrad. The Soviets lost significantly more. There was their commander, Field Marshal von Paulus, who would surrender, and the first German Field Marshal to ever surrender. Hitler actually promoted him right before the surrender, thinking that he would commit suicide rather than be taken prisoner, as a kind of a prestige for Hitler. And that should tell you something about the authoritarian dictator. He talked about the people and doing this for das Volk, but to him, all he cared about was himself. And the German people were nothing more than lives to be wasted for him. And this goes to the same thing with the glorification of the military. This glorification of the military was so that they make sacrifices for the leader and die for the leader. It's not the individual people. That is the difference. And don't forget, though, fascist ideas are totally opposed to the liberal feeling, the liberal philosophy of individual rights. It's a few people on top. But here are Germans taken prisoner. And remember I told you this was a war of annihilation? Those prisoners taken at Stalingrad would not be released from prison. So this is going into 1943. They would not be released until 1954. And 90% would die in captivity. The Soviets kept them long after the war ended. They would not be released until after Stalin died. And there's a famous story of Stalingrad, absolutely ruined, bodies everywhere, hell on earth. And a German lieutenant is walking one of the POWs, and a Soviet officer grabbed him, pulled him out, and said, "Wait until we get to Berlin." What the Soviets would do to this, or the Germans would do to the Soviet people, and how many they would kill. We're talking over 20 to 30 million people killed in the Soviet Union, and the Germans are going to get revenge. And when they started pushing this Germans back and seeing what the Germans had done to the Soviet Union, I'm always just amazed in this horrific way that the Soviets left any Germans alive. Because what the Germans did would be one of the greatest war crimes in history. What they did to the Soviet Union and they did to Poland. So, after this, a titanic offensive that they nearly cut off all the German troops here and pushed them all the way back here. Now, there's still massive amounts of the Soviet Union held by Germany, but they would be pushed back to this line. Eventually, the Germans would counterattack, and they would be holding on this line right here. So Stalingrad is way over here. This was a humiliating defeat. Some of the best reserves of the German army is defeated. They are literally running out of men. In fact, they're going to have to reform their units to base more on like machine guns and heavy weapons and away from manpower. But let's get to the German occupation then. This is the time to do it. When the Germans first arrived, they could have been seen as liberators. They came in, and these are pictures of them this is the Ukraine. Here is in Estonia. And when they first arrived, the Ukrainians were like, yes, the Soviets are gone. So Ukrainians wanted to be independent. And for some areas, like the Baltic states, like Lithuania and Latvia, the German occupation was not near as harsh for a lot of the people because there was a huge Germanic population. But the Germans absolutely blew their opportunity to get people angry at the Soviet Union on their side. Their ideology was that these people were inferior, this is their land, and that's how they treated them. So sure, they would take recruits from the Ukrainians, and they would recruit Russians as laborers, but for the most part, they treated this as an area to exploit and destroy and scoop up as much resources as they can. They stripped it blind, and hundreds of thousands of Soviets, Ukrainians, Belarusians would be starved. These could have been people that the Germans could have used to help them against Stalin, and they blew that opportunity. But remember, this was ideology. So by 1943, they had plundered the occupation area. But this was such a big area. And in their first initial advance, they had left so many Soviet troops behind the lines that they operated as guerrillas called partisans. And so these are partisans right here. These areas in red are areas of partisan activity, where guerrillas behind the line. And the Germans used brutal tactics of reprisals, where they would kill 100 Soviet civilians that they would hold hostage for every one German killed by a partisan. The idea being is that the partisans would not get any civilian help, and using this terror tactics, they could control this area. Well, of course, not to Stalin. He demanded more attacks. And this would eat up hundreds of thousands of German troops behind the lines. A similar thing would happen in Yugoslavia. Partisans would actually drive the Germans out of Yugoslavia in 1945. And here are that's an example of German reprisals. They would do the same thing in France, but not quite as brutal, but still horrifically brutal. They'd put lists up, and these are people we will kill if there's any partisan attacks. And eventually, hundreds of thousands would be starved, and this is where you get that German idea of revenge. Here is, and there are so many horrifically brutal pictures, people being hung, starved. Here is, they're searching a young boy, and this is right before he is going to be hanged. Here is another one. This one I don't know his fate. That is right before a firing squad opens up on hostages, and here are hostages killed in a Soviet town because of a guerrilla attack. And so these reprisals would lead to the desire of revenge, and this was a literal war of annihilation. And people forget, they would really forget after World War II, people in the United States. They would look at it as this Soviet steamroller. Their army is so powerful, they beat the Russians, or they beat the Germans. Americans never understood the absolute hell that happened in the Soviet Union and the destruction of much of Western Soviet Union and how that affected them to this day. But we're leading up to the last big battle we got to get in the East. I mean, there's so much here, but the rest is going to be a horrific war of attrition. And the battle is going to be called Kursk. And a massive attack. Now it's just on one little section of line. There's a salient right here, and the Germans thought they could attack here and here towards Kursk and cut off this Soviet salient. And this was going to be in the summer, July of 1943. And the initial attack was going to be in the spring, but Hitler turned this relatively minor offensive into a massive offensive, and Stalin was ready. Why? The same code breakers we've mentioned before. The British had broken the German code. They told Stalin, and Stalin had, and so the Russians knew and built elaborate defensive lines and just waited. And here are jubilant Soviets when the Germans started to retreat. And this would probably be overall the biggest single battle of World War II, the biggest tank battle of World War II. And the Germans would advance with new tanks that they had been making in 1943 to match the very good Soviet tanks. Panther tanks, which were probably the best tanks of the war, and the massive Tiger tanks. Now they broke down a lot, but remember, partially because of slave laborers. Talked about that before. But they had broken, or they thought these new tanks would give a parity or an advantage to the Germans. Now, the Soviet tanks were the best tanks overall of the war, and even though one-on-one they might not have been as good as a Panther or a Tiger, the German tanks were unreliable. They were so brand new, so they had a lot of problems anyways, teething problems, and they were outnumbered. And so after the initial German breakthrough, the German army was stopped after minimal gains and then destroyed. Here is just a slight little bit of how far they advanced, not very far at all. Casualties were horrific, and this would turn into a decisive Soviet victory, a titanic Soviet victory. This broke the back of the German army. The German army never recovered. And here are Soviets on the advance after the battle. And this is, they would call it all during the war, they call it Soviet style, where Soviet infantrymen would ride on the back of a tank, which is not a pleasant thing. I guess it's better than running 20 miles. And these are German tanks and light tanks destroyed at Kursk. This destroyed the German army. This changed everything. This was like one of those, ooh, for the Western Allies. The British and the United States slowly mobilizing thought they had time to invade and to attack the Germans because they're going to be, they'll be bogged down with the Soviets. Now the Soviets might win the whole thing. And this would lead to a huge counteroffensive, where the Germans would be pushed back to this line right here. And now this horrific battle of attrition, where the Germans would simply be ground down to nothing. And the only reason the Soviets had to stop there by the fall of 1941, or I'm sorry, the map says 43, the reason why is they simply ran out of supplies. And so you're going to get these huge, titanic Soviet offensives, and then wait for supplies and reinforcements, and then another massive offensive. This would turn the tide of the war. Another thing to turn the tide of the war was the second part of the Battle of the Atlantic, and this would be a decisive battle. Right away, as well, remember, as the Soviets are fighting, the U.S. and the British have to build up supplies. And so to do this, they started using convoys. And they had to get the convoys past the German blockade, the U-boats. This is not only a lifeline to Britain, but then also a build-up to bring the war, take the war to the Germans. Open up what they called a second front. The first front is obviously the biggest, the Eastern Front, the Russian front. And ships were going down. This is a famous one. Loose lips might sink ships. The idea of people talking in harbors in Britain and the United States about when convoys will leave. German spies, espionage will pick this up, and German U-boats like this one right here will be waiting. And so, the second part of the battle, can they get supplies across? And one ship I have to mention, because a lot of you might know this, it's called the Bismarck. The Germans made one of the best battleships of the war. Now, looking back at it, this was a horrific waste of German resources. To build this battleship, they could have made almost 20 U-boats. That's how expensive this battleship was. But they tried to get this out into the open seas to raid commerce, to sink ships and stop convoys. And the British would have a titanic effort to find and destroy the Bismarck. Here's the Bismarck. It had 8 15-inch guns. This is it being hit during a counterattack. In fact, a battle right here, the Bismarck, through an unlucky shot, or I'm sorry, right here, would destroy the queen of the British fleet, the HMS Hood, with one shot. And this massive battleship, the Hood, would go down, and over 3,000 British sailors would die. Only 3 survived. And this would lead to a titanic effort, where eventually the Bismarck would be sunk here because of planes from aircraft carriers, what they're already learning, or what they would learn in the Pacific. The Bismarck's a great story, but it's a relatively minor part of the war. The big thing were the U-boats. And the U-boats, a couple different things. First off, they called this the second happy time. As soon as the United States entered, they began to sink ships right off the shore of the United States, literally inside of it. That is an American tanker. It sunk off New Jersey, and they could see it sink. The Americans did not adopt blackout, did not adopt convoys. The ships were not escorted, and German U-boats just laid and wait and sunk them. Now, this would be in the first 6 months. The United States would evolve tactics, and the Germans would move to this area right here, outside of aerial reconnaissance, and they would use a wolf pack tactic. So they would get information either from submarines or long-range aerial reconnaissance that a convoy was coming, and they would try to get a number of subs in a pack to attack them at night. Wolf pack tactics. And these wolf packs, here is a picture of a bunch of submarines. Okay, it's not actually the actual wolf pack, but you see some submarines attacking together. And they would even do it on the surface. Come right into the middle of the convoy, fire as many torpedoes as possible, then submerge. Here is a painting of a German submarine firing a wolf pack, a torpedo. This is a wolf pack attack in the gloom of the North Atlantic. You see this is just as a torpedo hit. And here is a convoy. In 42, they sunk a lot of ships. It looked like it might work. Here's a ship going down. This is the rough North Atlantic. These are British sailors chipping off ice of a destroyer. And that should give you an idea how horrific it was in the North Atlantic. If a sailor or a seaman, a merchant marine, if they were on a ship that got sunk and they jumped overboard, they would die of exposure, of hypothermia, within 10 minutes. That's how awful it was in the North Atlantic. And so this just was chewed up sailors, but needed to happen. They had to win the War of the Atlantic, or the United States and the British could never take the war back to the Germans. And this, they actually call it the Black Pit. Outside of aerial reconnaissance from here and here. This shows you how many ships were sunk in 42 by wolf packs right there. And so with that, the Western Allies would finally win this. How did they do that? I didn't know what else to call it, but a number of reasons, but one was just pure guts. 80,000, about split 50-50, of sailors and civilian merchant sailors would die, being sunk on ships, killed in action. But they kept going. In fact, the great folk singer Woody Guthrie would join the Merchant Marines, and he would actually get sunk twice. Three different times. His ship would be hit, and he would survive. He's most famous for writing "This land is your land," or "This land is my land." And so, but how they did it though? Escorts, and not only destroyer escorts, but escort carriers that carry about 20 planes that could provide aerial reconnaissance. But one of the big things was depth charges. And here are depth charges right here. And they would be rolled off and they would explode at a certain depth underground. So that is an exploding depth charge on the right. Depth charge on the right. And the idea was, if they could figure out that the sub was like 100 feet underwater, they would trigger these depth charges to explode 100 feet under the water, with the idea being it doesn't have to hit the submarine, but the shock wave, which would be amplified under the water, would damage the sub, and either it would, well, once it starts leaking water, they have choice to hopefully they could surface or it will sink. Submarines are really vulnerable. Their defense is underwater and they have to be thin-skinned. On aerial reconnaissance would be key. By aerial reconnaissance, the German submarines had a difficult time, at least during daylight, submerging and recharging their batteries, and this led to fatigue. Submarines had to spread out. Aerial reconnaissance would be huge. And these are the Catalina flying boats, long-range Liberator patrol planes. The British and the Americans used a lot of that. But one of the biggie, and you can't really see it there, but remember they broke the code. And so using the Enigma breaking of the code, they knew where the wolf packs were, or at least had an idea. But also technology. We've already mentioned radar once before, and this is a radar mast on an American destroyer, but also sonar. Sound waves underwater that would be reflected off of, well, hopefully submarines, and would pick up where they're at. And if you ever watched a submarine movie from World War II and you hear this little ping sound, there's my good imitation of one. That is the sound waves. And here is a German submarine that's been hit and sinking. And this would turn the tide by 43. Here's a German submarine under attack. This technology and just pure guts. Here is another German submarine under attack. Here are the number of Allied ships sunk. And that's 42. And you notice how it dropped dramatically by the end of the war. And German U-boats sunk went up throughout the entire war. This would be a major turning point. So, with that, now, convoys, still dangerous, still risky. They could now bring supplies. And the first major Allied, Western Allied action would be in North Africa. Now, I can't go into great detail about this, but Libya was an Italian colony. And they decided, kind of on their own, that they're going to try to take the Suez Canal, a major point of transit for British commerce, because they needed to get to their colonies in India, etc. And they advanced a little bit in Egypt, and the British pushed them back here, and then Hitler felt he had no choice but to send reinforcements, and they pushed back this way, and the battle raged back and forth across North Africa. Now, this is going to become really overplayed by the British because it's only a few troops, but they're fighting somewhere. They're tiny, minuscule amounts of forces compared to what's happening on the Russian front. But back and forth across North Africa, back and forth. And one of the things about it was, because there's no cover and much of it is either flat sandy desert or rocky desert, this would be perfect action for tanks. Here's German tanks, and these are British tanks, but they're actually American M3, they call them Grant tanks, that the British got in Lend-Lease. They weren't great tanks, but since the Germans didn't have great tanks either, these would be decisive, and they were better than the British tanks. There's a weird thing of a 75 millimeter gun here and a 37 millimeter gun here. There are a lot of flaws, but the first American tanks going to battle would be with the British. And also two names we have to get. First off, this would be the field where small German forces, because they couldn't send many across the Mediterranean, German and Italian forces, under General and then eventually Field Marshal Ernst Rommel, who would become a hero in the Battle of France. He would get the nickname the Desert Fox by using his armor and flanking movements totally outfoxed some of the British. And eventually the British would be under the command of their most famous and best general, who was also intensely arrogant and annoyed Americans, General, and eventually Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Everyone called him Monty. But he was a very good general in a lot of ways. And the most famous British general of the war, Field Marshal, that's the equivalent in the United States Army. In fact, the U.S. had no rank when the war began that was equivalent to a Field Marshal. In World War II, there'd be 5-star generals. The highest ranking U.S. like in the U.S. Army right now is a 4-star general. There were 5-star generals in World War II, like Eisenhower would be, to match his rank. And we're coming to the turning point battle in North Africa, the Battle of El Alamein. Rommel advanced to within 90 miles out of the Nile River, so threatening the Suez Canal. But there they ran out of supplies. And the British built up supplies, a lot of it now Lend-Lease supplies, and under General Montgomery, they counterattacked. Actually, the British got there, or the Germans got there in October. There would be 2 battles about Alamein, but in November, the British made their full counterattack at El Alamein, and a bloody, horrible battle would take place. My phone is ringing. I'm not going to answer it. I'm just going to shut it off. So, take a break. I have no idea who called, but could be anybody. So, with that, this would be the turning point battle. The British would break through the German line, which was severely out of supplies and overextended, and they routed the Germans, and this would lead to a long retreat. I love the great headline, Rommel routed. Those are Italian and German POWs. This is German equipment that was destroyed and left behind as they retreated, and they would retreat. Going back to this map right here, that it won't let me go to. Here's El Alamein right here. The Germans would retreat all the way to Tripoli with Montgomery in hot pursuit. And this is where the United States forces came into action for the first time. The first American forces being built up, and they were desperate to get in the battle. And the decision was to attack colonies controlled by the Vichy France in 1942 in North Africa, Morocco and Algeria. In November 1942, the first American forces would land. Those are some of the first American forces in landing craft ready to land at Casablanca. They would land here at Oran and Algiers. And this was not just U.S. forces, some Canadian, British forces, and some Free French forces, hoping that the French would get into the war. Now, these were actually defended by Vichy French forces. And there was some fighting, but for the most part, they either surrendered and went into internment, or many of them joined the Free French. But these were French colonies. And these are American troops when they would land, and they had on their arm all over American flags. They're hoping the Vichy French would not attack them, because they were Americans. The French hated the British by then and were furious at them. And I'm not going to go into great detail of this battle, but once the Vichy French surrendered, the Germans pulled back, or there weren't hardly any Germans here at all. And so The main fighting would be in Tunisia. So you have Rommel retreating this way, and the Germans would pour in foolishly, but Hitler thought we could hold it. They poured in from Italy over 300,000 troops, mostly German and also Italian troops, to try to hold down in Tunisia. And they counterattacked. Rommel did. The first American forces right here at a place called Kasserine Pass. And that is an American tank with a Bedouin right behind it. That's a German tank destroyed. And the Americans were routed. This is the first time the Americans faced a real German army, and they were not ready. American tactics would have to change dramatically. Fortunately, the Germans didn't have enough to exploit the breakthrough, and the Axis forces would be swallowed up. This was an important moment for the United States Army to learn, frankly, how to fight against the Germans. Eventually, over 270,000 German and Italian soldiers would surrender in Tunisia. And the big thing about that was they had lost over 300,000 at Stalingrad. And so this should give you an idea of how a horrible 4 or 5 month period this was. It might not have had the same overall impact as Stalingrad, but Tunisia was a huge victory. Italy would not recover. And just after the Germans and Italians surrendered in Tunisia, Churchill and Roosevelt would meet in Casablanca. Now, Casablanca was in Morocco. It had been taken by the Americans, and they're going to meet here. And in fact, they are going to eventually go to Cairo and then Tehran from here. And at Tehran, they're going to meet with Stalin. And here in 43, a couple things happened. Here, the realization hit that, okay, North Africa fell. Where's next? Where do we go next? So FDR and Churchill. And they decided here, Churchill convinced Roosevelt, he convinced him that they're not ready to attack across the English Channel into France and open up a real second front. Churchill wanted to peck away at the Mediterranean, thinking Italy is weak, Germany is weak there. And so they're going to attack at Italy first. But here is where they would make a fateful statement. And this is when Roosevelt was asked, okay, when Germany is near defeated, are you going to negotiate a peace agreement? Meaning, are you going to have conditions for peace? And FDR said, we will not negotiate with fascists. We will demand nothing but unconditional surrender. And he would later claim, I remember Ulysses S. Grant saying that, unconditional surrender Grant. And he said that because of this reason. And I was told by I had a professor in college who told me that Churchill was appalled that FDR said unconditional surrender. Because unconditional surrender means that what Roosevelt's saying is we will destroy Germany, conquer it, until they must totally capitulate, and then we decide the peace. And if that happens, that will encourage the Germans to fight harder. And Churchill was appalled. Now the Germans will never quit. And that's what I was told. And I would find out, this is a professor actually I didn't think much of. And looking back at it, for good reason, I was right. No, they had talked about this in advance. They decided on unconditional surrender because they were worried that Stalin would make another agreement. Stalin made that non-aggression pact in 38, and they figured, Stalin might just say, let's just negotiate a peace with Hitler. He'd done it once before, they might do it again. This is FDR and Churchill's way of saying to Stalin, we vow to fight to the finish, you fight to the finish. And so that's what happened here. And one thing I should add, this is right before Kursk. And so they were still thinking that Stalin might not win. After Kursk, everything would change. And so, unconditional surrender. And fighting Adolf Hitler makes perfect sense. The problem was, in the Pacific, the Japanese plan was to hold out for an unconditional, or hold out for a negotiated peace agreement. That was the Japanese plan. And this in the Pacific, it's a war of empire. These are all about colonies and getting colonies and building an empire. And when Roosevelt said this, this also implied that that meant Japan must unconditionally surrender. Think about Bushido. And also think about what's going to happen if FDR dies before the war ends. And will the next president be stuck with the burden of unconditional surrender? Put big stars by this, asterisk, circle it. This unconditional surrender will be hanging around the next president, President Truman's neck. So with that, they decided on the Italian campaign. Churchill believed this was the soft underbelly. Germany is weak here. He, in fact, wanted to attack maybe into Yugoslavia. He thought Italy would surrender and they'll be right on the borders of Germany and therefore avoid a bloodbath like at the Somme. He's thinking World War I, and he was in the trenches in Belgium for 6 months of World War I after he got fired as First Lord of the Admiralty. And so he thought this would be an easier offensive. Italy's weak, Mussolini's weak, it would be the easy way to go. He convinced Roosevelt that they don't have enough troops to attack here, so this might work. By the way, at first, this infuriated Stalin. Millions of Soviets are dying, and the British and the Americans are doing little piecemeal attacks. And so, thus the Battle of Sicily. Sicily's the island. So if you look at Italy, going back here, here's the foot kicking the ball. The ball is Sicily. And the thought was they have to attack Sicily first. Actually, this made sense. Take Sicily, open up the Mediterranean for commerce and trade. And the Americans are like, we got to take it anyways, let's go here first. And so the attack on Sicily, this mountainous, rugged island, and the Germans and the Italians fought very hard to hold on to it. At this island, an American general named George Patton would gain fame for pushing his men further than any other army and actually kind of getting to two big prizes, Palermo and Messina, while the British under Montgomery seemed much slower. Now, actually, the Germans defended there harder, but that doesn't really matter. Patton would gain fame, and he would become the most feared American general. Unlike Montgomery, who seemed very conservative and slow, Patton seemed daring, much more like a general that would be at the Eastern Front, fighting with the Soviet or the Russian, or the Soviet or the German army. But in Sicily, Patton, 2 different times, slapped and kicked soldiers visibly reeling from battle fatigue. In World War I, they called it shell shock. Today, we'd say PTSD. And because he said they were cowards. And the bad publicity, because of this, he would be removed from command. Be kind of a big deal when he got command back, but the Germans always thought he was the best. You know, yes and no. When Sicily fell, Italy surrendered. Mussolini was ousted, Italy surrendered. And it seemed like, oh, it worked! And that convinced for a quick jump across to attack into Italy. But the Germans just simply occupied Italy. Mussolini would be in charge of then a puppet government of fascists, but they occupied it. And the thing about Italy is, there are rugged mountains. This picture really shows it right here. Rugged mountains all the way across Italy, very narrow plains to fight, rivers crisscross it for defensive lines, and the Germans just made a very powerful defensive line across the isthmus of Italy. And so the Allies landed, pushed up to this line, and got bogged down month after month, and Italy turned into a horrific quagmire. Here are Germans along this mountainous line, dug in. You can see vineyards right there. One of the most bloody battles was to take an area right here at Cassino. And so Monte Cassino was where there was a monastery there. And some of the most horrific fighting of the war were thousands of American soldiers. There was Polish soldiers who had escaped Poland, and they would be stuck in this fight. Free French, Canadian, Indian, British, Australian. This bloodbath where this beautiful monastery would be destroyed by Allied bombing. This is it being rebuilt. But just to give you an idea of just the horrific fighting 43 into 44. And it was clear by the fall of 43 that Italy was a quagmire. On June 5th, 1944, the United States Army, or the United States and the British finally liberated Rome. Here they are entering Rome and by the Colosseum. But by June 5th, this was already a bloody, awful sideshow. Thousands would die. Italy would be devastated. But some of you might know this date. The next day would be the real opening of the Second Front, June 6, 1944, D-Day. So, while Italy is going on, I know I got to bounce ahead. By the way, that German helmet I have, in fact, don't move, I'll be right back. Oh, I don't have it. But, you know, World War I helmet I showed you in class, that was actually taken at a battlefield in Italy. This is in April 44 or 45, up here where they broke through the second line of the Gothic line. They finally broke through the Gustav line, but then got to this line, and they were there for 6 months. But at Tehran, Iran, Hitler, Stalin, and Churchill met. The big three met for the first time. The Soviets just occupied the northern part of Iran, and the British occupied the southern part to get Lend-Lease supply to the Soviets. This will have effect down the road. But here was a lot different. Stalin, before Tehran, had been bitterly criticizing the Americans and the British for not opening up a second front, for not crossing the channel and opening up, attacking. At Tehran, in the fall of 43, Stalin was not quite as belligerent. Stalin was more like, well, you know, if you have to delay the second front, that's okay. Well, I know it's tough. I understand why you have to attack Italy. I understand. Don't worry about it. We will defeat the Germans. And that terrified, especially Churchill. Why was Stalin like that? Kursk. After Kursk, Stalin realized he might be able to beat the Germans mostly alone. And who knows what might be in the post-war world. And that is when Churchill's like, oh, if we don't attack across France, Stalin will dictate the future. And therefore, he finally agreed with Roosevelt that they will open up a second front. They promise in early summer 1944 that they will attack across the English Channel and invade France because the Soviet steamroller is coming. Also, I should add that Stalin, who remained neutral in the battle against Japan, promised, you know, when Germany's defeated, I might enter that war. That might have consequences down the road. But that's Tehran. And the big thing about Tehran is Germany's still a potent fighting force. So this is still, we got to win the war. The next big conference will be a year and a half later at Yalta. And there, it's the post-war conference. So let's get to this. So here's what it looked like then. Here come the Soviets. Here is the third front, as they called it. But here's the main front. It's going to attack this way. And they agreed to that at Tehran. This is from Time magazine. They didn't really know where it was. By the way, I should add, it says Stalin. General Marshall was assumed to command this, but the British would not allow Marshall to command everything, so they had to come up with a compromise. Here is Nimitz and MacArthur here. So, while that's going on, the British and the Americans had been taking the war somewhat to the Germans. They called it strategic bombing, but this is an element of total war. Strategic means long term. So we're going to attack their industry and oil production, but it's also to break their will to resist. Remember total war. Civilians became legitimate targets. And if you want to knock out the industry, the best way is to kill and terrify and destroy the workers and where they live. But there's also an element of revenge. Remember the Blitz of what they did. So here's the great Royal Air Force smashing German industry, and Britain would put a vast amount of their economy and manpower into strategic bombing. Here's an American propaganda about bombing, about with homes destroyed, deprived of utilities like electricity, evacuated, wounded, killed. This will destroy their will to resist. So this is to target civilians. Now, oh, somebody just noticed, if I said Hitler, Stalin, and Churchill met, that would have been quite a surprise. Let's go back. That's one of the things. I'm looking at 3 different screens and I'm trying to organize everything. Of course, I do this in class too. Stalin, FDR, and Churchill met. That would have quite a shock to invite Hitler to this meeting. So I repeat, Stalin, FDR, and Churchill met. Stalin, FDR, and Churchill. All right, that's pretty funny. Why would you invite Hitler and tell him your secret plans? That seemed to be a mistake. All right, so. And here is the idea of, this is in 42, showing here we come, we're bombing German cities. It's also showing how they're bringing supplies in a horrific Arctic trade route to the Soviet Union. But the British bombed at night. The reason why is they tried to bomb at the beginning of the Blitz at daylight, and they lost so many bombers, they went to nighttime bombers and used the night to protect them. But the problem with night bombing is that they couldn't see their targets. And basically, they just let the bombers go and just hope they would kind of form over German cities. And so their navigators had a very difficult time. And so there's certain times a day, certain times they didn't want to bomb. Pitch black, they had better protection, but it was harder to see. Full moon, German defenses could work better. And the Germans started using radar more and more. But this had to be area bombing. And when I mean area bombing, what it means is this. They're just going to set up a grid across German cities and try to bomb, get bombers inside these big areas, basically hoping to kill as many civilians as possible. So here's a British Liberator bomber, one of the best bombers of the war, flying over German cities. You can see this weird streaks of flak. The camera moves, so it gives that kind of streaky look. Flak, I should say what that is. Flak is taken from the German word for the shrapnel that would be from anti-aircraft guns. So anti-aircraft guns would fire big explosive shells with the idea when they explode, they put out jagged pieces of metal. And the idea was, hopefully these jagged pieces of metal, the enemy planes would fly through it and rip them apart. It was going to be very difficult to actually shoot down a plane. And so when they would see American or British bombers, they would just try to fill the sky up with anti-aircraft shells, so there was flak everywhere, and force the bombers to fly through it. Now this is actually a daylight attack near the end of the war, because by the end of the war, the British could start bombing it during the daylight because the German defenses were so beaten. And these are fire bombs. Small little bombs filled with white phosphorus that would, when the white phosphorus hit air, it would burn until it basically ran out of fuel. This is a big bomb. They called it a cookie. Sometimes 8,000, 10,000 pound bombs. And the idea of these would be to hit houses, buildings, and just blow up big pieces of it, wood all over, with the idea being open it up for the fire bombs coming afterwards. And this was purely designed to kill as many people as possible. And this is Dortmund, after one of the first fire bombs. And it's hard to see right here, but much of this part of the city here is absolutely destroyed. But the biggest, first really big raid, they started attacking cities, but these were relatively, bloody, awful raids, but 100, 150 bombers. In 1943, July of 1943, the British decided to try a massive firebombing attack. In July, they would hit the big German city of Hamburg. Over 500 planes would attack, and the first planes would attack carrying high explosives and cookies, with the idea being to blow up a bunch of buildings, so there's a lot of damage there. And then the next wave would come in with white phosphorus and firebombs. And this is a picture of, that's a British Liberator bomber flying over it. And these are all the fires that are being started by the firebombing. And this is the result. Destroyed city. Look at all these buildings absolutely devastated. Half of Hamburg was destroyed in the fire. And this would create one of the first man-made firestorms. And a firestorm, and this is the big and the horrific killer of these type of bombing. And this is something they always underestimated for atomic bombs. The big killer would be the fire. They always talk about the radiation, and that would be hell down the road, but the firestorm. So just imagine a fire. And so a fire is starting to start sucking in oxygen, sucking in oxygen. Well, as the fire gets bigger and bigger, it sucks in more and more oxygen, and superheats to 500 or 1,000 degrees. And it sucks in more and more oxygen, increasing the heat, and it kind of builds up on itself and explodes over. And that's the storm effect. But it sucks in oxygen. Pretty soon the winds are going at 100 miles an hour as it sucks in oxygen to fuel this bigger and bigger fire until it runs out of fuel. And so this fire just begins to not only destroy entire cities, even people who got down to their shelters. Underground bomb shelters built all over the town. This would suck the oxygen out, and they found thousands of German civilians who are asphyxiated in these shelters from this firestorm. 43,000 German civilians would be killed. And this would create the shock. The Germans hoped this would convince Germans to quit fighting. Well, actually, it convinced Germans, kind of like what happened in the Blitz. We got to fight harder because look what they're willing to do. And soon they would firebomb other cities, but they would not firebomb to this level again until 45. Yes, the United States would learn from this. Here are a couple of the more famous pictures, German civilians looking at some of the destruction. Look at the city right here, and that's one of the most famous pictures of a family being rescued under the rubble of a building that had collapsed upon itself with a firestorm. And this would become the kind of the best example of total war. And we're going to jump right to this. The U.S. bombed during the day. And the United States, when they started building up more bombers, especially by 1943, they thought their very heavy bombers could survive bombing at daylight, survive bombing German fighters and anti-aircraft fire, and therefore at daytime they could do precision bombing. They could actually hit the targets they were aiming at and put bombs right on factories. They thought they could do it. And this is an attack. This is in Dusseldorf. And look at this. You can see right there. Those are bombs. The plane that took it, they just dropped their bombs. As it turned out, they were not as accurate as they thought. The Americans took horrific losses. Here's a good picture looking through the gun, one of these side gun mounts on a B-17 bomber. You can see all these explosions. That's the flak. German fighters in flak took a horrific toll on American bombers, much more than they thought. In fact, the life expectancy of some of these bomber crews in 43 and 44 was 12 missions. And these B-17s, really amazing planes, tough, durable planes, had between 12 or 15 50 caliber machine guns all over the plane to try to protect them from enemy bombers. They did have some effect, but they would be shot down. So many would be shot down, and crews would be killed or captured. Here is from, this didn't work. So they bombed and bombed, and the thing about it was not near as effective as they thought. We got to get moving through here. These are German civilians in Hamburg. This is in, oh my goodness, Bremen, and just barely surviving. The chapel somehow made it. And if you look at this map right here, these, like the bigger ones here, that is the percentage of the city destroyed. And I don't mean just damaged, I mean gone by Allied bombing by the end of the war. So Berlin, about 33% by bombing. I should add, then the rest would be destroyed by actual war. Hamburg, over half. Dortmund, over half. Cologne, 2/3. And virtually every German city would be devastated by the bombing, the center of the town. But it did not break their will. It did not do exactly what they thought. There would be anywhere from 400 to 600,000 civilians killed. Millions of refugees. As you see this German woman looking through the bodies of the dead, and that's in Berlin in March of 45. But the German industrial production actually peaked during the heaviest bombing. They made more tanks and planes by the winter of 44. And how did they do it? These are two different factories building. These are actually the brand new jet fighters that came too late, fortunately. And these are tank destroyers called Jagdpanzers. They actually made them in underground. They dug tunnels, they spread production out, and they kept building. It did not work the way they thought. And it came at a horrific loss. Here are American B-17 and B-24 bombers. So the Americans and the British would end up dropping almost 2.8 million tons of bombs. But this is actually pretty amazing. The United States would lose 79,265 men lost in action. Half would be killed. The British would lose about the same number. And that means if half are killed, that means 40,000 American and 40,000 British crewmen or British bomber crewmen died. This was unbelievably bloody. People forget how bloody this was, this bomber offensive. But you might notice one other thing. Fighter sorties and enemy planes destroyed, because in 1945 or 44, after horrific losses, a brand new American fighter, actually it's a real team effort. The P-51 Mustang was an American plane design with a British engine, and it turned out to be the best plane of World War II and one of the best planes ever made. It had the range to escort American bombers all the way to Berlin and back, or wherever else they attacked, and this chewed up German fighters. German fighters were not as good, and they didn't have the fuel to train their pilots successfully. And by the end of the spring of 1945, the United States had complete air superiority. So these are P-51s. That's a great picture of a P-51, and it's flying, escorting an American B-17 bomber right here. And look at these two pictures. Those are German planes they shot down. He was eventually shot down himself, but survived. But this plane devastated, destroyed the German Air Force, chewed it up. And Hitler would take fighter planes from the frontline units and put them back to Germany to defend Germany, and a disaster. Here is, I'm going to show you, well, I'll finish with this. But this destroyed, but one other thing it did destroy, when they started focusing on railway yards and oil production, that is when it really did have some effect. It devastated rail yards, it really hurt German production, and Germany had virtually no oil. They were making what they called synthetic oil, but a process of getting diesel from coal, which wasn't very effective and took up a lot of electricity. But this really had a huge impact on the war effort. It didn't destroy the factories like they thought, but did hurt industrial or transportation and oil, and the big thing was air superiority. This bloody action. But last thing I promise. While this is going on, what of Japan? Japan's strategy was to hold out, turn this into a costly war of attrition, fight so hard, inflict so many casualties on the United States that will force the United States to negotiate a peace agreement, conditions. That's what they're hoping. After Midway, they realized they weren't going to win a victory, but if they can make it so bloody and awful, the United States would be forced, or just say, it's not worth all of these dead, we'll negotiate a peace. Remember, that's condition. They should remind you of something, unconditional surrender, what Roosevelt said at Casablanca. And this is from a Los Angeles newspaper article, and it's showing all these Japanese bases here, all these islands, that the Americans are going to have to chip their way through island by island. And the Japanese have decided to occupy these and fight to the death. They don't want to hold these islands, and they know they're sacrificing their troops, but they figure we'll kill so many Americans that they'll eventually say, okay, you win, and the Japanese were thinking we'll hold as much, at least keep something of what we had conquered. By the way, you notice one that might take a decade. In 42, they thought this war might go on well into the end of the decade, which, wow. And so the first attack, I should backtrack here, the United States, when they started rebuilding after Midway, the Japanese were building an air base right here. And the decision was made, we got to do it. And Marines that were actually on the way to Australia to stage for a different attack were diverted, and they would attack Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal, this island right here in the Solomon Island chain. And to give you an idea how slipshod this operation was, the code name was Operation Shoestring. And this would turn into a bloody, almost a year-long fight along the Solomon Islands. These islands right here north of New Guinea, where the Japanese poured in troops, planes, and men to hold these islands, with the idea being make them suffer as much as possible. And the Japanese poured in, as it turned out, much more than the Americans realized. Guadalcanal was hell on earth. The U.S. did not have enough men to totally take the island. The Japanese Navy was strong enough to make it difficult to survive. These are the first troops that arrived there. There weren't many Japanese defenders on there, but they poured in troops. And soon it turned into 6 months of one of the most awful fighting you can imagine, for about 15,000 Marines and eventually another 10,000 or 15,000 U.S. Army soldiers. Huge naval battles would be fought around Guadalcanal, in the last big carrier battles of the war. These titanic naval battles. And at first the Japanese did quite well, but the United States would eventually overwhelm the Japanese. And this would devastate Japanese reserves. Devastate. The Japanese poured in men and ships to try to hold out, which, by the way, went against their plan. Instead of just holding out and let the Americans beat their head against it, the Japanese tried to pour in troops because they couldn't stomach losing these islands. Which, if you look at this map, look how far away it is. These are here. They should have held back. And the Japanese on this island fought to the death. Japanese would sneak in reinforcements at night, and they would charge American positions. You can see the idea of the jungle fighting right here. Charge American machine guns. These are Japanese staging for the attack. And they would be mowed down in waves. And there's stories about the horrific night attack by the Japanese. And the Americans would soon dub these bonsai charges, that the Japanese would yell, kind of like hurrah or huzzah, bonsai, and when they would attack, and they would just be slaughtered. And the Japanese would fight to the death, and some Japanese soldiers would hide grenades on them, and when they surrendered, this happened a couple times on Guadalcanal. They would pull the pin, taking the American Marines with them. And that's where pretty soon it's like, you can't take Japanese prisoner. And you'll see pictures later on in the war where the Japanese soldiers will be stripped naked so they could see if they did surrender. They weren't holding a grenade. But virtually no Japanese soldiers surrendered, and this would become the template for the rest of the war. Partially Bushido, but it's partially Japanese tactics. We'll take so many Americans with them, they'll negotiate a peace. And eventually the American command would be, the plan was, as they began to build up forces, in the Central Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz of the Navy, a very competent admiral, they would attack this way, bouncing islands, so they would hop island to island, avoiding really strongly held islands, getting an island as a base, moving to the Central Pacific. And in the Southern Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur, they would leapfrog heavily defended areas on New Guinea and then working their way to the Philippines. It was not clear they're just going to, what the actual strategy to win, just get as close as they can to come up with the main strategy to win the war. They superimposed the United States, just to give you an idea how big this battle was, how over it such a titanic way. So in 43, the first really big island hopping, I thought I put another picture there, but I didn't, would be at in the Gilbert Islands right here, and the island of Tarawa. And Tarawa, Marines took it, and it was a slaughter. On this tiny little island, this atoll, the Japanese fought from every single inch and held out and took over 1,000 Marines killed or wounded with them. Now, the Japanese were doomed, but this was quite a shock. Are they going to fight this way on every island? On every island? And American casualties were much more than they thought. They realized they need even more bombing, more shelling from the sea. But still, this meant every island would be hell on earth. Here are Marines on this atoll, and they were dug into the coral reef, and they would dig a tunnel, and it would be almost impossible to root them out without flamethrowers or bombs. And the Japanese would defend every inch. This is going to be a major battle of attrition. But something else happened here. The United States realized that the Japanese never rushed in reinforcements. The Japanese were pulling back. The Japanese, especially after the Solomon Islands campaign in Midway, were much weaker than the United States realized. They're going to fight for every island. But this accelerated their plans, and maybe they could open up another front a little bit later on. And that is where we lead to the last bit of the war. And we're coming to D-Day. So D-Day in the last bit, tomorrow will be tomorrow. That's the last bit. Are there any more questions? I repeat, at Tehran, Churchill, Stalin, and FDR, the big three. I should add, Churchill and Stalin didn't really get along. FDR, who could charm anybody, they kind of respected each other. But Stalin was so much smarter than anybody expected. He was so intelligent and so careful and definitely thought long term in a much different way than Churchill and FDR did. So with that, tomorrow we'll finish the war of the quiz. 8 to 10 questions, should be another really basic quiz. I'm going to type in the documents. I'll give you those documents on the dropping atomic bomb. They'll look like a lot of pages. Then once you look at it, realize it's the way it's formatted. It's not that much, but it tells you so much about the thinking about dropping the atomic bomb. And hopefully I've set up a lot here. I can't go into great detail about D-Day, but if you would have taken special topics, we went into great detail on D-Day. All right, if there's no more questions, I got a question. What years for the review? Are we talking about the review for the review packet, the overall review packet, or review for the test? For the quiz tomorrow, for the I know. The thing about it is I saw it, I'm broadcasting this, it's about 15 seconds, 20 seconds behind what you see. So there's a delay. And so I saw what Jesse typed in, and I'm a little behind. I'll say for the review packet, and this might answer the question. For the review packet, so stop at 1896. And so that's the review packet. So for the review packet, stop at the end of 1896. So that's about a third of the way down to page 6 of the review packet. And then what I'm going to do in the week before the exam, I'm going to pick out a few that you're going to need to know. But hopefully the stuff from 1896 through 1945 will be relatively fresh in your mind. And if you can print it, please print it and write it out. I think that's a better way to remember it. Because when you're doing the DBQ and you have 45 minutes, you don't have enough time to try to review and remember things. So if you already have something in your mind that you could refresh memory, it would be much easier to go back and look for exactly where you want in the review packet to write that DBQ. Because don't forget, for that DBQ, you have to relate the documents to specific facts, and you need a couple other specific facts on your own, and you need to put context, other events going on at the same time in the opening paragraph. And so the less time you have to look, the better off you'll be. Any more questions? All right, and then after, when I get done with this next week, I'll put all that stuff in there. But after we get done with this, we will do a review, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the 50s and 60s, kind of toy along with it, because we still got to finish American history. Everything takes longer, and I'm taking more time at this because I can. But we'll go through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, kind of just finish on, because if we're still doing this, when school, after the AP exam, we just have to kind of treat it like a normal, the AP exam is just like one essay, not this overall test on everything. All right, if there's no questions, I am hanging up. Goodbye. Have a great day.